Hi there, Pastor Danny here. Just wanted to chat a little bit about what we're going to be doing this coming Sunday. At Hastings Church of the Nazarene, we're preaching from Luke 15, 1 through 3, then 11 through 32. We're looking at this incredibly familiar story, the story of the prodigal son, right? We know the story, we know what's happening. It's going to be a fun time preaching this so well-known passage. But I think we need to do a little prep work before we get to this Sunday, because if you notice in verse 3 of the passage, it says Jesus told them this parable. And then it goes on from verse 4 all the way to 32. He told them this parable. This is singular. And we tend to think of Luke 15 as having three separate parables, right? It has the parable of the lost sheep from verses 4 to 7, and then verses 8 through 10 have the parable of the lost coin. This is how it's split up in our Bibles, and then the third parable is the parable of the prodigal and his brother. But Jesus says it's one parable, or Luke writes that it's one parable, the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost sons. This is all one story. We tend to preach it or teach it in segments, and we tend to break them up. But I want to contend that this is one story, and that, in fact, maybe the titles of the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, the parable of the lost sons, the prodigal, I think these might be inappropriate titles. And I think maybe we should see them, and hopefully by the end of this video we'll be able to see that this is one parable of the found sheep, the parable of the found coin, and the parable of the found sons. It's about those things that have been found more than they are about those things that have been lost. And I also think it's about the one who does the finding, the agent who does the finding. It's about the shepherd who finds the sheep. It's about the woman who finds the coin. It's about the father who finds the sons. So this Sunday we're going to look primarily at the third movement of this one parable, but I want to spend some time looking at the first two, because if this is one parable, then we need to see this all as one story. So I want to spend some time giving us a little bit of context on the first movement, the parable of the lost sheep, then the second movement, what's called the parable of the lost coin. And one of the things we note right off the bat, and I will say a lot of this comes from an incredible book that I've been rereading this week in preparation, called Jacob and the Prodigal: How Jesus Retold Israel's Story by this incredible scholar, Kenneth Bailey. And so one of the things that he notes and that I want to talk about is that Jesus is using imagery that would have been well known to his audience, who are the Pharisees. This would have been language that was very familiar to them, particularly from the Psalms. Jesus uses these three images of God, these three images that were familiar to Israel from the Psalms, in order to tell this one parable. The first is of the shepherd, right? We know Psalm 23, the good shepherd, right? But then there's also a psalm that talks about how Psalm 139, I created you in my inmost being, you knit me in my mother's womb. There's this and others. There are times when God is labeled as a mother. And if you remember a few weeks ago, we looked at how Jesus said, Jerusalem, how I've longed to shelter you as a mother hen does her chicks. The language of God as a mother is also relevant to our lesson, because Jesus says in the parable of the lost coin that a woman lost this coin. This is kind of recapitulating the language of God as mother, and then God as father in the third movement of the prodigal. These are all familiar symbols, familiar titles, or positions for God. Now, one thing that we know that's interesting in the first movement in the lost sheep, or I would say in the found sheep, let me read it, is verses 4 through 7. Jesus told them this parable: which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, rejoice with me, for I found my sheep that was lost. Just so, I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who need no repentance. Now, we can't get into everything that's going on here, but one of the things we note here is, in the tradition of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, there are there are good and bad shepherds. Psalm 23 talks about the good shepherd. But in this prophetic movement, there are good shepherds and there are bad shepherds. And Jesus seems to be combining these two, talking about this one shepherd who is both bad but turns good. Because this shepherd loses one of the 100 sheep. This is not okay. This is a bad shepherd who has lost something. But then the shepherd does what should be done and becomes good and leaves the flock in order to bring this one back. And Kenneth Bailey writes that Jesus seems to be saying to his audience of scribes and Pharisees, you are the shepherds of Israel. You have lost your sheep. You should go after them, but you have failed to do so. To compensate for your mistakes, I am going after them. You should rejoice with me. Instead, you come complaining. Can't you see that I am making up for your mistakes? So Israel has been the bad shepherd, but Jesus does the thing that they are unwilling to do, and he goes to bring that one back. And culturally, a sheep was for a shepherd was life. It was food. It was their money, essentially. It was their commerce. And they lose this one thing, and they've lost a lot. They've lost their means of living for their family. So this is an incredibly important thing. And in one out of 100, what we see in here is we see the numbers descending. The first story is 1 out of 100. The second story is 1 out of 10. Then the third story is 1 out of, well, it's actually both out of 2. But we need to see the gravity of what's happening in the story. For a shepherd to lose this one sheep is incredibly detrimental. But then when the sheep is found, notice that the sheep does not come back. The sheep does not make its way back to the flock. The shepherd goes in order to bring it back. And then once that shepherd is brought, the shepherd says, rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost, calling all of his friends and neighbors together. There is this incredible rejoicing, and knowing a Middle Eastern culture, we can understand that there would have been a huge banquet associated with this rejoicing, that all of the neighbors and family coming back together, they would have had this huge celebration for this one sheep that has been brought back. So seeing this first story, there's this incredible celebration that takes place. And then if we move to the second part of this one parable, the second movement, if you will, the parable of the lost coin, we see the female language here. And why? One of the questions is, why would Jesus talk about this woman who had 10 silver coins? And as we noted, it's going from 1 out of 100 to 1 out of 10. And actually, this coin is incredibly important. Jesus uses the language of a woman, compares God and himself to this woman, because that's been historically what Israel has done in her life. The Pharisees would have understood this. But then also, knowing a little bit about first century culture, this is an important coin. This coin would have been more valuable than the shepherd for this woman. See, this coin represents what a dowry coin, a coin that she would have received when she got married. Should she lose her husband, should he leave her, or should he die, she did not have the rights that he would have had in that culture. And this dowry coin was essentially life insurance. If she did not have her dowry coins, then she could not prove her inheritance, her family, her life. This dowry coin essentially gives her life. If she loses it, then somebody else can take her property, somebody else can take her land, they can take everything away from her. But if she can if she has this coin, if she can prove that this is the family from which I have come, this is where my husband is from, then she has her life insurance. And so this is more valuable than even a sheep. And we see that in terms of a ratio, instead of being 1 out of 100 things that are lost, it's 1 out of 10. And this one thing is absolutely significant for this woman's entire life. And so we see something else that happens. The coin, understandably, this is inanimate. The coin does not find its way back to the woman, but the woman she lights a lamp, she sweeps the house, and she searches everywhere until she finds it. She is doing everything possible to find this coin, as if her life depended on it, because it does. And so she searches and she finds the coin. The coin does not return to her. And then what happens when she finds the coin, when she recovers it? She calls her friends and she calls her neighbors, saying, "Rejoice for me, for I have found the coin that I had lost." This once again would have been a huge banquet. Everybody's celebrating that she has found her life insurance again. She has her means of living again. And then in the third parable, the third story in this one parable, we're going to see this a bit on Sunday. We're going to dig deep into the parable of the prodigal, the story of the prodigal son and the prodigal brother as well, the wayward brother. We're going to look at this, but instead of being 1 out of 100 that's lost or 1 out of 10 that's lost, it's 2 out of 2 that are lost. And so I think it's important for us to see a few things here. If you notice at the end of the first story in verse 7, I tell you there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who need no repentance. And then in verse 10 about the lost coin, just so I tell you there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Now this is interesting because how do we typically understand repentance? Repentance is us doing the thing that we're supposed to do. We turn away from ourselves. We move towards God. But what we see in the first movement and in the second movement and what we're going to see on Sunday, even in the third movement, is that the sheep does not come back to the shepherd. And the coin does not come out of that crack in the floor where it fell. No, the shepherd finds the sheep, and the coin is found by the woman. I think these stories are more about the one doing the finding than they are about the thing being found. And so repentance then, according to Jesus in Luke 15, repentance is accepting being found. It's when the shepherd finds you, it's being willing to be carried back to the flock. When we are that coin that's found, it's getting back into the purse with the other 9 coins. Repentance apparently is not the action on our part so much as it's us responding to the agent who does the action, which is God. Repentance is accepting God's bringing us back into the fold. And something else we note is that in both of these stories, and even in the third, as we'll see on Sunday, the sheep is lost and the coin is lost from where they began. The sheep was originally a part of this larger flock. The coin was originally a part of this larger purse. So when we talk about us in our evangelistic endeavors, going and bringing people, going and finding the lost people, one thing we've got to note is we are bringing them back to that which they belonged. For we all are created in the image of God. When we find them, if we do the thing that the Israelites didn't do, if we are not the bad shepherd, but if we live into the good shepherd as Christ is calling us to, if we do that, we're bringing them home. We're not bringing them to this, it might be a little bit foreign, but it's about bringing them home. It's about bringing them back to the thing that they were originally a part of and created in the image of God. We all come from him. And so it's bringing people back. And so another question that we have to ask ourselves is, do we rejoice well enough? Do we call our neighbors and our friends? Do we kill the fattened calf and celebrate? Because they're celebrating in heaven, evidently. Do we celebrate as well as Jesus talks about this shepherd and this woman who calls in everyone to say, thanks be to God? Or, we're going to ask this on Sunday, are we like the elder son who, when this one is brought back, when there's this pomp, where there's this celebration, where there's this, in essence, prodigal celebration, because prodigal just means lavish or extravagant, when there's this prodigal celebration, do we act like the elder son, which we're going to look on Sunday about this? Do we say, I didn't even get a lamb. I deserve this. what we see in this one parable of the found things. This is the parable of the found things, not the lost things. This is the parable of the finder, not the one who is lost. So as we come on Sunday, as we prepare our hearts and our minds for worship, as we are anticipating hearing the word of the Lord, come expectantly and come with this in mind about the found things, and come living into this parable, living into this story. Will I do whatever it takes to find these things? Am I doing what's necessary? Am I sweeping the floor, turning on the lamp? Am I leaving the flock? Am I getting out from the safety from this holy huddle? Am I willing to get out to find that one, to bring them in? And will we rejoice at their return? Come expectantly this Sunday. It's going to be an important day as we continue looking at this one parable, focusing primarily on the story of the prodigal and the wayward brother. Grace and peace to you. You are loved.